In this video, I will be making a beginner-friendly terrarium within a jar with many plants and mosses. Here are the materials that we will be needing for the substrate layer. First is sphagnum moss. Second is earthworm casting. Third is activated charcoal. Fourth is orchid bark. And lastly, we have cocoa fiber. Now for a mixing bowl. You will also need a cup to measure your materials with. This can be any cup, but for this project I'll be using a glass drinking cup. You'll need to have 2 parts of sphagnum moss. Make sure there are no sticks in the sphagnum moss, otherwise you might have a mold outbreak. For a terrarium of this size, you should usually cut it up into smaller pieces. Now it is time to add the cocoa fiber. First you will need a little bucket of water, and then you place in the cocoa fiber chunks from the brick. Be careful not to use too much, because as you can see here, it grows quite a bit. Instead of 2 parts like the sphagnum moss, you'll need just 1 part of cocoa fiber. And dump that in. Next up, we have the worm casting. Worm casting provides beneficial nutrients to the plants that are going to be in your terrarium. This, you'll just need 1/4 part. Now for the activated charcoal. This you'll need 1/4 part of activated charcoal. Activated charcoal helps remove toxins, bacteria, and excess moisture from the soil and water. Now it's time for the orchid bark. You'll also need 1/4 part of orchid bark. Orchid bark ensures proper aeration and drainage in the soil. Now with everything ready to mix, we'll mix it as well as possible to get everything evenly distributed everywhere. This substrate mix should be resistant to compression and light and fluffy. Now that the substrate is ready, we will need a glass jar with a screw-on lid. Any jar will work, but for this build, this jar is approximately 6 inches tall. We will be using LECA for the drainage layer. In case you were wondering, LECA is just clay balls. This will be going at the bottom of the terrarium. For this size of a terrarium, the drainage layer should be about 1 inch thick. Weed barrier is used as a substrate barrier. You can also use window screen mesh for this as well. The weed barrier should be cut to a little bigger than the jar outside itself. The substrate barrier should be placed on top of the drainage layer. The substrate barrier prevents any substrate from falling down into the drainage layer. It's time to add the substrate into the jar. This step is going to be pretty messy. Instead of using my hand, I'll use this spoon. Make sure you pat it down so it's nice and even everywhere. You should slope it up a bit to give it more depth. Now it's time to get the moss ready for the terrarium. Sometimes the moss has little bits of dirt on the bottom. We can use some water to wipe off as much dirt from the moss as possible. This can also work as a way to get off any pests that we don't want in our terrarium. Now grab some scissors because we'll need to cut off the bottom part of the moss. This won't hurt it and it will help us place the moss down easier in the terrarium. Once all the moss is cut, it's time to add the moss into the terrarium. You can place the moss everywhere like I'm doing here, but make sure to leave some room for the plants we will be adding later on. Using my tweezers, I'm gently patting down the moss into the substrate. This will help it anchor down faster. And for the plants I'll be using is a ruby red peperomia, a smaller, I forgot what it's called, peperomia, and a pink Fittonia. To acquire your cutting, cut off from the bottommost area of the stem and make sure not to cut it too short because we will be sticking most of the stem into the substrate. For the smaller peperomia, we'll be doing about the same thing as the larger one, which is of course cutting off the bottommost area of the stem so we can plant it deeper in the soil. We'll be doing the same thing for the pink Fittonia. And all these plants I'm using are great beginner plants for your terrarium. Especially these Fittonias. These Fittonias are super duper hardy and make a great beginner terrarium plant. I'm grabbing the stems, the bottom of the stems with my tweezers so I can plant them deeply down into the substrate. Make sure to plant them deep into the substrate, and these Fittonias will root super quickly. I have to be really careful with adding these peperomias in because these ones are super fragile. These are springtails. The springtails will eat any mold and decaying matter in the terrarium, which will keep the terrarium living a long and happy life. I'm going to grab a bit of activated charcoal with some springtails on it and tap it on the side of the glass so some of the springtails fall off and onto the plants. These springtails will make their way down into the substrate and keep the substrate aerated and healthy. I'm going to give this terrarium a light spray down all over the plants and moss. Make sure everything is moist and not dry. But of course don't overwater it because this could damage the terrarium. I hope you enjoyed making this terrarium with me, and of course thank you for watching. If you want to check out some more terrarium builds, check out this one here, as I think you might enjoy this one.